Hi, my name is Codex, and in this video I'll be discussing my thoughts on what the future holds for Warrior DPS in Shadowlands. Obviously, Warrior DPS is pretty stinky right now, and I think that we can collectively agree that getting a purple parse while being absolutely dumpstered by a green parsing DK is truly the greatest of feelings that can be experienced in World of Warcraft. Fury is even worse than Arms right now, though the gap between Fury and Arms at the top end really isn't as bad as a lot of people seem to think it is, at least judging based off of talking to other warriors. The real issue is that playing optimally as Fury takes a lot more effort than playing optimally as Arms. So it's not simply that Fury is less damage, it's that it takes more skill and effort to be good at, and does less damage. Conversely, with Arms, it does more damage, and the same amount of effort will get you more DPS than it does for Fury. So it just feels like a much larger gap because you get more out of the effort that you're putting in with Arms than you do with Fury, and sooner. Now, this could just be because I am a bit of an eternal optimist, but despite all the doom and gloom, I think that Warriors are actually not in as terrible of a position as a lot of people are saying. Sure, it'd be great if we could actually top the damage meters right now. It'd also be great if the buffs that we did receive weren't so underwhelming and actually made a meaningful impact on our DPS relative to the other specs. But on the bright side, both specs actually feel pretty fun to play in my opinion, at least assuming that you don't look at the damage meters, and there's also lots of nuances and optimizations that you can discover and learn when playing both of the specs, which for me at least makes for a more enjoyable playing experience. But the big question on most warriors' minds is, why the heck haven't we gotten another buff? Because it sure seems like we need one. My hypothesis for why we've only received lackluster buffs and we haven't received another buff that we seemingly need is because Blizzard knows that if they do too much now, warriors are going to need to be nerfed later in the expansion, and they don't want to do this. That, or they just have no idea what the heck they're doing, which is also very possible. So let's talk about why I think the future is bright for Warrior DPS. Because Arms is a rage management style of play, whereas Fury is a pump and dump playstyle, as gear gets better and stats improve, they scale differently. There are lots of variables that influence the damage scaling profiles for both specs, and some of these variables don't change all that much over the course of an expansion, so I'm going to start off with one of the more obvious ones, which is our ability damage ceiling. That is, the damage ceiling for our ability usage is when we can fill every global cooldown with the highest damage ability available. How close we can get to this ability damage ceiling is mostly a function of how much rage we can generate. For Fury, the ability damage ceiling is when we can fill every single global cooldown with Rampage. This means that Fury has an incredibly high damage ceiling, because outside of Torghast, it would take a truly astronomical amount of secondary stats to make this possible. This also means that increasing our rage generation will always yield a consistent amount of increased DPS. For Arms, there's basically two ceilings. The first ceiling is during our Condemn window, and the damage ceiling is when you can generate at least 32 rage every global cooldown. Now, it's 32, not 40, because when you use a 40 rage condemn, if the target doesn't die, you get 20% of the rage back, putting you at 8 rage each time. This, unfortunately, is unobtainably far off, but it's not as far off as the damage ceiling for Fury. The second ability damage ceiling is for DPSing outside of your condemn windows. During this time period, if you've taken Fervor of Battle, the max possible amount of rage that you could be spending during this window is 30, because Whirlwind costs 30 rage, Mortal Strike costs 30 rage, and in theory, like worst case scenario is that you never use Overpower. If you're running Massacre, that maximum average would be 22 rage per global cooldown. Now, if you're filling every global cooldown with a statistically normal ability, that would result in you spending, on average, about 15.5 rage per global cooldown. Obviously, in reality, it doesn't really work like this because different abilities have different rage costs, but I think that it gives a decent middle-of-the-road sort of estimate for how much rage we would need to be able to generate in order to not ever get rage starved. For reference, in my current gear, using this modeling, I'm generating an average of 14.6 rage per global cooldown, and if you extrapolate that out to what I anticipate late expansion crit and haste levels might be, attaining rage generation rates above that 15.5 rage per global cooldown threshold are definitely attainable. If and when this happens, that will mean that increasing your rage generation as Arms will have diminishing returns on the DPS gained. Increased rage generation isn't the only way that warriors will increase their damage over the course of this expansion. Another primary consideration that will have a large influence on our DPS is from our legendary powers. The common belief is that over the course of the expansion, we will gain the ability to equip a second legendary, similar to what happened in Legion, and I also buy into this belief. Now, I must admit that I don't know how well the other class legendaries will synergize, so maybe warriors will still somehow get the short end of the stick, but honestly, I think that warriors are going to be looking pretty good if and when this happens, especially Fury. Right now, for arms, the best option for the first legendary is the Signet of Tormented Kings, which makes casting Avatar, Recklessness, or Ravager/Bladestorm grant one of the other abilities selected randomly. Now, I have no specific math behind this, but my gut feeling is that the strongest second choice for arms is Enduring Blow, which gives your Mortal Strike a chance to apply the Colossus Smash debuff. I feel like this combo might work really well with taking Anger Management over Ravager, as first, it would allow for a high Colossus Smash uptime, and secondly, it would also increase the rate at which we Bladestorm, meaning that we'd get more bonus Avatar or Recklessness procs. It definitely should be noted, though, that I very well could be overvaluing this combination simply because I think that the playstyle would be interesting, and therefore think it's good just because I want it to be good. The other potential best second choice for Legendary that I see is, unfortunately, the immensely boring Judgment of the Arbiter, which just gives a frequent damage proc that is doubled if you have a friend running it too, and you're both positioned correctly. The rest of the options seem pretty lackluster to me. I'm not a huge fan of Exploiter because Mortal Strike still has to go through boss armor, so it only starts doing more damage than Condemn with 2 Exploiter stacks and 2 Overpower stacks, and only about 10% more damage. This legendary will provide some additional free bonus damage outside of Condemn windows though, because if you get Sudden Death procs, it buffs the Mortal Strike. But my gut feeling is that it's not going to be beating out Enduring Blow. Battlelord isn't likely to be all that useful because we're going to be generating more raids than we currently do later on in the expansion, and therefore we're not going to get any meaningful benefit out of reduced rage costs. Unhinged is decent for burst DPS, but doesn't provide a ton of overall DPS increase. It is worth noting, though, that this legendary effect gets some additional benefit by running Mortal Combo, because the extra Mortal Strikes can proc Mortal Combo. Shout out to Matthew Hilsden for confirming this in the comments of my arms guide. If Warrior DPS somehow gets even more sneaky relative to the other specs, then getting Echo of Ionar might provide the highest net raid DPS for arms. Right now, the best single target option for our first legendary as Fury is Deathmaker, which gives our Rampage a chance to apply the Siegebreaker debuff. As for looking at options for our second legendary, the options are generally less interesting than the arms ones, but the synergies that they provide are more obvious. Based on the current simulations, the best choice for a second legendary is likely going to be Will of the Berserker, which is basically just free crit chance, assuming that it can be properly sustained. Judgment of the Arbiter is still just as strong and just as boring as it is for arms. Cadence is basically Will of the Berserker, but with haste rather than crit, and it's less punishing and also less good. It's still quite strong though. Echo of Ionar is more valuable for Fury than it is for arms because Fury has more damage multiplier sources, meaning that each additional source that we can gain is worth more, making it a potentially viable option even if you ignore the bonus that it provides to other players. For AoE fights in Mythic Plus, Signet of Tormented Kings is likely going to be the choice, or rather, to be more correct, Deathmaker is probably going to be the choice because Signet is the best choice in those cases. Now, I'm not sold on Signet being the best choice for a single target second legendary, but I could be wrong here. Now, I totally want to believe that Reckless Defense would be a super strong pick for a second legendary, because I really enjoy the idea of having a really high Recklessness uptime playstyle, but given how Fury doesn't really care about crit, its value is really low. And even if we did care about crit, based on my modeling, it would only start getting meaningfully strong once we were approaching BFA levels of crit, and I highly doubt Blizzard is going to let that happen ever again. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and give you my predictions for what I think is going to happen with Warrior DPS by the end of the expansion. First and foremost, I think that we're going to be scaling better than other classes, and so by the end of the expansion, I think that it's likely that we're going to be a pretty competitive DPS spec, though probably not at the very top. Next, based on my incomplete and crappy math, as well as some gut feelings, I think that if we do get to use a second legendary, then there's 2 potential outcomes for Warrior DPS. Outcome 1, Fury is going to overtake arms, though if this does happen, it's not going to be by a lot. Outcome 2 is that the Enduring Blow and Anger Management build will turn out to be really good, and then arms is going to absolutely decimate Fury's damage. If we don't get a second legendary, then arms is probably going to continue to be the best option, but the gap between Fury and arms is going to shrink. The meta will likely be to continue playing arms because the damage profile of arms is really good, and also its AoE capabilities are really strong right now. As always, I would appreciate it if you could tell me in the comments what's wrong with my ideas and predictions, what I should have considered but didn't, and why things won't pan out the way that I think that they will. Also, feel free to share your thoughts on what you think that the future may hold for Warrior DPS. Finally, I encourage you to come back to this video at the end of the expansion to make fun of me for how bad my predictions were and how wrong I was. And with that, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.